Hi, this is Delaney, and this is my CJ 495 Senior Seminar final presentation. My topic this semester is capital punishment, and I focused on its history, efficacy, ethicality, and its place in contemporary America. So first, just to give you an introduction and some context as to how serious the issue of capital punishment is in the United States, according to the American Civil Liberties Union in 2023, an estimated 15,269 people have been executed by the United States government since the institution of capital punishment in America. So I focused in my paper on the really tumultuous history of capital punishment, its questionable efficacy, its very controversial ethicality, and the theoretical, methodological, and ethical review that all of you focused on as well. So, some key issues and facts in the literature surrounding capital punishment. First, it's important to know that the death penalty made landfall in the United States with the colonial British in the 1700s. Capital punishment originates in British common law. However, it was passed into codified United States law in 1790 when United States Congress passed the first ever crime bill. However, when it was passed into US law, its proportionality was heavily debated because it was applied for crimes other than crimes that resulted in loss of life, like treason and piracy. Today, it's only applied to crimes where there's loss of human life. But because of this application, it was often subject to presidential pardon because sitting presidents varied in their opinion of how proportional capital punishment was. So in the first decade that capital punishment existed in the United States, 64 out of the 118 capital eligible cases were pardoned presidentially. Michigan was the first United state to ban capital punishment in 1846, and this happened a year after the American Coalition for the Abolition of the Death Penalty was formed. By the time that the Civil War rolled around, capital punishment was no longer federally mandated for certain crimes. There was very little uniformity in the death penalty's application, as a lot of rules and regulations fell by the wayside in the chaos of the Civil War. However, a lasting legacy of the death penalty during the Civil War was that during the Civil War, the death penalty was more frequently applied against Black men. And there are a couple of instances in the literature that I looked at that explained capital punishment as a justified means of justice in the United States during the Civil War, because it was a needed remedy to extrajudicial lynchings against Black men. So this is often cited in the literature as an explanation of why there are racial inequities in the death penalty's application today. In 1972, Furman versus Georgia was a case that was heard at the Supreme Court level in the United States. And this case heard and determined that capital punishment was unconstitutional, as the United States Supreme Court deemed it cruel and unusual. In light of this finding, there was a federal moratorium that was placed on the death penalty in the US. However, that was lifted in 1988 when that case was overturned at the Supreme Court. As of today, there are 23 states that have fully abolished the death penalty. 3 have a statewide moratorium. And the states that have the most heavily populated capital death rows are California with 690 residents, Florida following farly behind with 323 residents, Texas with 199 residents, Alabama with 166, and North Carolina with 138. In terms of philosophy and lines of thinking that surrounded the death penalty in the United States, many famous American thinkers like Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Quincy Adams have held unfavorable views of the death penalty, and they were inspired by the classic Italian criminologist Cesare Beccaria. The capital punishment line of thinking in the literature in terms of people favoring it is that it's generally favored because it's viewed as a deterrent, incapacitative, and retributive method of dealing with justice in the United States. It is criticized in literature because it is inconsistently and politically motivated in its application. And a lot of literature finds that there's no empirical evidence of a deterrent effect resulting from the death penalty on murder rates in the US. There's also been in recent media drawn attention to an exponential rise in botched executions in recent years. So 37% of the attempted executions on United States death row in 2022 were botched, which is an astronomical number. And botched just means that they were failed in their application the first time around, and that staff had to come in and reattempt the execution 1 to 2 to up to 4 times. Since 1988, 190 death row prisoners have been exonerated and freed, which means that 190 people had to sit on death row while the person who actually committed the offense they were charged with was out free in society. So there's also a really controversial degree of uncertainty that goes along with the death penalty, where people are really concerned that we can execute someone and then find out after the fact that they may have been innocent. In terms of theory most frequently used in the literature to justify the use of the death penalty in the United States, we have deterrence theory and rational choice theory. And deterrence theory is based on the premise of deterrence, which generally just says that the discouraging effect that punishment can have on crime is beneficial. So general deterrence asserts that the mere threat of punishment, like the death penalty, discourages would-be offenders from even offending in the first place. However, some tenets of criminology surrounding deterrence theory is that it must be proportional to the crime committed, that the punishment must be swift in its delivery, and that it must be certain in its delivery. And critics point out that a lot of these tenets aren't met because some people argue that the death penalty isn't proportional. It certainly isn't swift, as the average death row wait time before execution is 18 years from sentencing. And it's also not certain because of these exonerations where we see innocent people serving time for a crime that they didn't commit, while people that actually commit the crime are out in the general public. Additionally, a criticism of deterrence theory as it applies to the death penalty is that murder rates are no lower in states where the death penalty is an eligible punishment. Rational choice theory is based on the idea that anyone considering a crime sits down and undertakes a kind of cost-benefit analysis and then comes to a rational choice of whether or not to commit the crime. However, rational choice theory is criticized in its application in the context of the death penalty because it doesn't explain the senseless crimes that people often describe, which are generally the ones that result in capital cases. So cases where there's really severe mental illness, where there are crimes of passion, crimes with little to no premeditation, things of that nature. And rational choice theory is also heavily criticized because if death row inmates are aware of the possibility of a capital sentence in their state, then rational choice theory would assert that they probably wouldn't have rationally chosen to offend. And we see that that's just not the case. Some methodologies that are used to study the death penalty in America are secondary data analysis, which is generally used to examine the frequency and trends in the application of the death penalty, and surveys, which are usually used to gauge kind of public perception surrounding capital punishment. So secondary data analysis is the process of obtaining a person or organization's data and undertaking one's own statistical analysis of that data. And some sources of data used in secondary data analysis can be private sources where you can pay to access their data, public sources that make their data freely available, large databases that have sets available like ICPSR, and in the context of the death penalty, most often we see government records at the local, state, or federal level, even census level in terms of death penalty research. Some strengths of secondary data analysis is that when you're using secondary data, there's no need for researchers to constantly go out and collect data, which can be a really lengthy and expensive process. And secondary data use gives us a really good longitudinal view of the analyses of the same set of data over time. Some weaknesses of secondary data analysis. Primarily a weakness is that secondary data analysis in the literature is criticized as only being as good as the data that it uses. So if the data sets that are used in secondary data analysis aren't reliable, then that secondary data analysis isn't going to give an accurate portrayal of death penalty trends in the US. Surveys are the process of collecting information directly from a sample, and samples are recruited via phone, paper, in person, or online. Some strengths of surveys is that they yield direct answers and that they're generally unobtrusive and non-invasive for participants. Some weaknesses are that surveys are vulnerable to response bias and poor sampling strategies. And overuse of secondary data analysis and surveys kind of limit what we know about the death penalty because if they're really the only two primary methods we're using, they give us a stunted understanding of what the death penalty really looks like in America, in that we overuse these methods. We may not be using other methods like interviews, whereas interviews could give more nuance of the death penalty through the view of, for example, death row inmates or correctional workers who work with death row inmates on a day-to-day basis, things like that. If we overuse these methods, then we're really vulnerable to the limitations that go along with those methods. One major ethical criticism of the death penalty an actor that's implicated by ethical dilemmas as they relate to capital punishment that we typically don't think about are medical doctors. So medical doctors are bound strictly by the American Medical Association's Code of Ethics, and this Code of Ethics has a lot of bylines and laws that relate to different applications of medicine. One of those applications is in the case of capital punishment. So under the AMA's Code of Ethics, doctors are obligated to prevent loss of life and minimize human suffering and pain. One of the bylines of the AMA's Code of Ethics is that doctors may not participate in the death penalty in any way, and this includes administration of medications, placement of IVs, or declaration of death for capital cases. So while doctors participating in the death penalty would likely minimize human suffering and lower the risk of excruciating botched executions that I mentioned, doctors also may not participate because they would directly contribute to loss of life in doing so. So they're caught in the middle of this dilemma where by participating, they would certainly be contributing to loss of life, but they may also be minimizing the pain that a death row inmate goes through in the process of that execution. In conclusion, there's a lot of controversy that surrounds the death penalty in America, and this controversy has bled into homes, the political arena, medical ethics, and criminal justice research. The many flaws that are associated with the practice of capital punishment in the United States point to the need for its abolition, as it's a really archaic practice that does not empirically benefit modern day life in the United States. And here are my sources. Thank you.